Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this month's virtual Spotlight Talk. My name is Ethan Snyder. I'm sure that you're all familiar with me by now, and I'm our Manager of Collections and Public Programs at the Wharton Esherick Museum. So today we're going to be covering a topic and some materials that are related to our spring exhibition that went up at the beginning of March that's called Voyage of Renewal, Wharton Esherick in Germany and Scandinavia, that'll be open through the beginning of June. All right. So I hope that you'll have an opportunity to stop by the museum's visitor center to see this exhibition before it closes, because the materials that it brings together from Esherick's 1931 trip to Europe are really quite something. Some of the materials that are in the show feel really personal, such as photographs that Esherick captured, and we're kind of in seeing the photographs that he took, seeing the views that he saw through his own viewfinder over 100 years ago. And other things that he brought back that are in the show feel really familiar, insofar as he was just kind of collecting a lot of mass-produced souvenir postcards like we still do today. And he was purchasing them along with thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of other travelers. So taken all together, I think the material in this exhibition gives us a really fascinating glimpse into the people, the places, and the sites that Esherick was taking interest in during his travels abroad. So we'll begin today's talk with some background information on Esherick's trip to Germany because the background does feel quite important. And then we'll take a few minutes to talk about Esherick's travels outside of Germany, attempt very briefly to reconstruct the excursion that him and his friend Hannah, who he went to visit, took around Scandinavia. And then we'll cover some of the travel sketchbooks that Esherick filled cover to cover during this trip. So the background of this trip and the series of events that leads up to it um, begin in 1929 at the Hedgerow Theater. The woman that we're seeing in the image to the left is Helene Fischer. She was one of Esherick's first major patrons, and she ends up fully funding his trip to Germany. So Ma Fisher, as she became to be known, purchased Esherick's sculpture Finale, which we see here on top of the Victrola cabinet, while it was exhibited at the Hedgerow Theater in 1929. And as we'll learn about in just a moment, Ma Fisher was a really wonderful and supportive patron, not only to Esherick, but to other artists as well. And her initial purchase of Finale at the Hedgerow Theater from Esherick seemingly spurred 15 years of major commissions and patronage from this individual. So it begins first with kind of work for Helene's Westmannery home, such as this Victrola cabinet that's now in the MFA Boston collection. And then things start to develop and evolve, such as Esherick's tour de force corner desk here on the left, made after he returns from this Germany trip in 1931, and this really funky, angular, and dramatic hall bench that has a similar kind of design lexicon to the corner desk. And we're just seeing Esherick kind of take on new dimensions in his work through Helene's patronage and commissions. So here we see the lane that leads up to Helene's home that Esherick memorialized with a 1931 woodblock print appropriately titled The Lane. And eventually in 1940, Esherick would design a new boardroom for Helene's company, Shoot Curting. Helene was one of the major stakeholders in this company and the eventual president. And Schutte Curting manufactured and seems to continue to manufacture industrial parts for machinery and things like that. And arguably, Ma Fisher's important patronage was possible during the late 20s and early 30s in the Depression era, precisely because of her connections and stake in this major manufacturing company. So Helene's patronage was also critical to a young German artist named Hannah Weil, who Esherick would meet in Pennsylvania in 1930 and would go on to visit in Germany the following summer on Helene Fischer's dime. Hannah Weil was a jeweler, a sculptor, and a self-taught ivory carver. Ma Fisher first encountered her work when she went to Germany to visit the Glass Palace exhibition of art in 1928. Like with Esherick, Helene and Hannah's relationship first began with a purchase and then turned into years of commissions and important patronage. The two women remained in touch after Helene went back to her home in Philadelphia. And after the death of Hannah's husband, that left her a single mother, and the global financial crash in 1929, she was invited to actually come to the United States and live with the Fisher family, where Hannah would make ivory carvings for their home. For example, she made a large set of ivory carvings as placeholders for dinner guests. So Hannah and Wharton were introduced, as far as we know, during a picnic that was held at Esherick's home that Helene was invited to attend. And at that point, Hannah was living with her, and the two of them went over together. And Helene Fischer sends her son York over to Germany. York is a young artist who his mother wanted to study with Hannah once she was able to return to Bavaria after her initial stay with the Fischers. And eventually, York and Hannah would marry. They would live in Germany for a number of years, but then in 1939, under the threat of war, would return to the United States, where they purchased a home and settled in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. So Esherick travels to Germany in July 1931 on a boat called the MS St. Louis, thanks to Ma Fisher's generosity. The boat was part of this new Hamburg America line and had only taken its maiden voyage just 2 years before Esherick was on board. And on the screen here, we can see one of the sketches that Esherick completed on the ocean liner's letterhead. I'm not quite sure whether this was done from the boat itself or on letterhead that Esherick just took with him, but it gives us an idea of kind of the supplies that Esherick had on board of this ship. And you might all be familiar with the ship MS St. Louis that Esherick took over, because it's actually most well known for an unsuccessful attempt in 1939 to bring over 900 Jewish refugees escaping Nazi persecution, first to Cuba. It was turned away, and then to the US, turned away, and then to Canada before it eventually had to go back to Europe. So, in any case, and that kind of historical coincidence aside, this ship delivers Esherick to Germany on July 22nd. His passport was stamped in the town of Cuxhaven on the North Sea. And from Cuxhaven, Esherick seemingly made his way to Hamburg, the closest city to Cuxhaven, before heading down to Hannah's home in Utting in Bavaria, which is relatively close, if not considered a suburb of the city of Munich. So here we can see this wonderful sketch that Esherick completed of Hannah's home in Utting, and a wonderful print that Esherick made of the landscape that he would ultimately print in a repeated pattern on a curtain and title Holzhausen. And this block printed curtain that Esherick created with his print was given ultimately as a gift to Hannah. And it depicts the farmlands leading down to the lake that her town was on and the on-deck monastery. I think I'm pronouncing that right, on-deck, that is rising in the hills above or on the other side of the lake in the distance. And that is still there today. And while Esherick was there with York, the two of them created this really wonderful work table for Hannah that's fit with a hole that she could put her carving vise into. And this table is now on view at the Wharton Esherick Museum for the first time ever. And arguably, it's never been in the studio until now. So it's a really wonderful way to experience this creation of Esherick's that was made elsewhere. So just as Esherick enjoyed sketching the landscapes, farmhands, and farmland all around Pennsylvania where he lived, he found a lot of similar inspiration in Hannah's countryside town that we see here in Esherick's sketch. So the exact itinerary for Esherick and Hannah Weil's trip around Northern Europe isn't 100% clear. We know that the two of them visited places such as Hamburg, Bergen, Stockholm, Gothenburg, Oslo, and Copenhagen before returning home to Hannah's house. But we also know from sketches and postcards like we have on the screen of Vadstena Castle that they made plenty of pit stops and passed through a number of other smaller towns, as we see from these kinds of ephemeras, sketches, and also some of the stamps on Esherick's passport. So, for example, here we have this postcard that Esherick purchased of Vadstena Castle, which helps us kind of discern what this pencil sketch is. And there are a number of pencil sketches that Esherick did of this castle in particular. And we're led to believe that they would have seen this castle together as they were traveling via boat between Stockholm and Gothenburg on the Jurta Canal. But we can also, in addition to sketches and ephemera like the postcards, attempt to reconstruct parts of this trip using the letters that Esherick wrote, and like what you have here, his passport that is full of stamps. Um, the stamps arguably don't tell us as much as we'd like them to. They give us ideas of dates that he was entering and exiting various places. But it appears that the ports that they stopped in and had passports stamped were not really the major stops on the trip that they had planned for themselves. However, there is a wonderful talk that the scholar Mark Spheri gave on Esherick's trip, and he made his own attempts to reconstruct it. And this was around a 2021 exhibition at the Michener Museum called Daring Design. And we'll be sure to link to Mark's conversation with our curator, Emily, in the follow-up email to this talk, if you're curious on learning a little bit more about a reconstructed itinerary for this trip. So now to the sketchbooks. Esherick purchased and filled out a number of sketchbooks during his travels, and I think it's so wonderful that we even have pictures that presumably Hannah took of him sketching in these books. So at the Wharton Esherick Museum, we actually steward 7 of the sketchbooks from this trip, and as far as we know, Esherick gave a number of others away. So as he wrote to his friend Theodore Dreiser contemporaneously to this trip, quote, "I filled 6 books of sketches and gave nearly as many away. So let me stop trying to use words and show you when you come some pictures." So before we attempt to stop using words in this spotlight and show you some of Esherick's quote pictures, let's talk about the sketchbooks themselves, because I think they're quite fascinating. So before Esherick and Hannah left to travel around Scandinavia, and even possibly before Esherick arrived at Hannah's home in Uting, he stopped by a stationery store and an artist supply store in Munich, Germany, called Adrian Brugger, which is on the Theatinstrasse, or the Theatine Church Street in the city, kind of old town section, where he purchased a bunch of Jor-S brand sketchbooks like we see here on the screen. And it seems as though, and I said this before, that Munich is the closest big city to Hannah's home in Germany. So it was likely a necessary stop on Wharton's way there in the first place, from Cuxhaven and then Hamburg. So when he stopped into Adrian Brugger, Esherick purchased the sketchbooks that he would go on to use throughout this trip. And according to the ephemera from this retailer that I was able to find online, it appears that Adrian Brugger advertised themselves as a specialist store in Munich for painting and surveying supplies, office and writing equipment, equipment for bookbinding, and even for model aircrafts. So it seems quite similar to the kinds of industrial art stores that Esherick might have been purchasing his own art supplies from in Philadelphia and Chester County. But Esherick didn't only just purchase and fill out 7 sketchbooks, he also purchased a number of paintbrushes as well, that are still in our collection today, one of which you can see on the top of the screen with the name Adrian Brugger written across it. And we're led to believe that Esherick may have completed watercolors like this one of Hannah's bedroom with these very paintbrushes that he bought from Adrian Brugger that we still steward today. And I think that that's quite a wonderful connection for us to be able to make. So what kinds of other places and sites did Esherick record in these sketchbooks in media that was not watercolor? Arguably, we can kind of break these sketches down into a few main themes, such as landscapes and cityscapes, architecture, some interesting sketches of furniture and sculpture as well that Esherick may have been seeing in public gardens, public parks as well as museums. So many of the landscape scenes, and we already saw this sketch that Esherick was completing while spending time around Hannah's home in Bavaria, must have been quite similar to the kind of rural scenes that Esherick was seeing around his own home in Chester County. And I use this photo, which was in Bob Bascom's biography of Esherick, titled The Road to Paoli from 1914, just to show the striking resemblance between these countryside towns that Esherick was taking an interest in. So Esherick's other Bavaria sketches record the group's leisure time outdoors, such as the two sketches that we see here. And wonderfully, the sketch on the right-hand side of the screen shows the exact work table that we now have at the Esherick Museum. And we can even see that Esherick records the details of the butterfly joins that hold these warped boards together. And here we can just see the table next to this sketch. And Esherick's really wonderful kind of expressionistic and quick sketch that really captures the essence of working at this table for the group. So another wonderful sketch from Uding in around Hannah's home actually records Hannah at work with a file, presumably working on one of her small and intricate ivory sculptures. And here we see some of the architecture in the town of Uting that Wharton Esherick took interest in. It's a little unclear as to whether these buildings in particular are still standing or may have been destroyed during the Second World War, but a quick search on Google Maps and their street view shows us a number of these very traditional looking timber framed houses with low roofs and balconies that are called Low German houses that are a very traditional vernacular style in Germany. And then to cities such as Stockholm, Oslo, and Copenhagen, as well as Hamburg. Many of the sketches, of course, naturally depict street scenes, buildings, and other urban infrastructure. So, for example, here we see a few of Esherick's sketches of Stockholm City Hall. This is a building that Esherick undoubtedly took interest in because we have at least 3 sketches of this building, only 2 of them on the screen here. And he writes to his friend Theodore Dreiser that Stockholm was, quote, a great city with trains and motors and boats weaving through the city. The Stadthaus, Esherick says, which means state house, is as fine a piece of architecture as I ever saw. And of course, Esherick tries to capture this in a couple different styles and levels of detail and from a couple different vantage points as well. So additionally, Esherick would capture scenes in Stockholm of city life, such as cafes, parks, like we see here on the left side of the screen. This is Strömpaddaren Park in Stockholm, as well as the city's train station here on the right side of the screen. So we also see Esherick taking an interest in a lot of Swedish folk art, such as Viking boats like we see here on the left that he saw in Stockholm, and the traditional Dala horses of Sweden that we see on the right side of the screen that I'm sure many of us are familiar with. And as well, we see some, I guess they're upside down on our screen. We could turn the paper around, but some interesting sketches that are measured of a trestle table as well. So in Gothenburg, Esherick describes to Dreiser in his letter, quote, bumping into interesting furniture and sculpture everywhere he went around the city. And while Esherick wrote to Dreiser about this furniture and sculpture that he was seeing in only a one-night stay in Gothenburg, he does mainly appear to sketch scenes of the city like we see on the left. So it seems like Esherick took a little less interest in sketching the sculpture and furniture that he describes in writing, and is more interested in describing these urban buildings in his sketches. But the photograph that we have on the right side of the screen that was taken by Esherick during his trips kind of give us an idea of this kind of public sculpture that he would have been seeing and describing to Dreiser, although we can't verify 100% that this is a picture of sculpture in Gothenburg, but it gives us an idea of the kinds of things that were inspiring to Esherick that he wrote home about. So this is where things I think start to get interesting in Oslo, Norway. So where Esherick appears to take the greatest interest in furniture and sculpture appears to be in Oslo. And while he was in Oslo with Hannah, Esherick visited the Norsk Folk Museum, which is known today as the Museum or the Norwegian Museum of Cultural Heritage. And from the Folk Museum, we find something a bit, not a bit, a lot more involved than Esherick's usual impressionistic sketches. And instead, we see this really interesting measured drawing from two perspectives of a trestle table that he probably saw at the Norsk Folk Museum. It's a little unclear as to whether or not Esherick and York Fisher built Hannah her trestle table before or after these Scandinavian excursions, but I'd love to believe that Esherick was kind of taking a lot of inspiration from the things that he was seeing at these museums before designing Hannah's table. That being said, the trestle table that we see here on the screen has legs that cross like an X. And here with Hannah's, we can see that it is a slightly different design, but I'd be curious to know whether Esherick was taking some inspiration from the measurements and ratios that he was seeing, or if he was really just interested in this kind of folk form of a trestle table. But we know from the postcards that Esherick purchased from the Norsk Folk Museum that he must have taken a really great interest in their collection of furniture, sculpture, architecture, and interior architecture as well. And this is not to say that Esherick didn't purchase plenty of postcards from elsewhere, such as the Swedish National Museum, but this measured drawing from the same museum that he's collecting postcards really does seem to suggest that he paid quite a lot of attention to the work that he was seeing at the Folk Museum and duly noting things like this trestle table. So we're starting to reach our time, and I don't want to keep us for too much longer. Um, and unfortunately, a half an hour or 20 minutes could never give us sufficient time to cover all of the various sketches that Escher completed during these travels to Europe. However, this is a reason why you should come and see the Voyage of Renewal exhibition, because you can see lots of this wonderful materials in person. And overall, this talk was much more of a show and tell that highlights some of the wonderful materials we have from this trip that we just couldn't fit in the exhibition itself. And it was not meant to be a kind of thesis-based argument about some particular aspect or outcome of this trip that was really critical to Esherick's career and kind of development as an artist. However, I think in going through these sketches, in trying to understand where Esherick's attention was paid, there are a number of really interesting themes that emerge throughout this work. And that is mainly Esherick's interest in vernacular architecture, an interest in rural life and rural labor, as well as a keen interest in experiencing art and culture. And in Europe, I think art and culture felt particularly revolutionary to Esherick because it was so publicly accessible. And he'll go on to submit sculptures and architectural models to organizations that would display them publicly, such as his first gravestone marker for Sherwood Anderson that was put on view by the Fairmount Park Art Conservancy in public for quite a long time. So I think Esherick really develops an interest in the public potential for art while in Europe. But after returning from Germany, Esherick explored these really new and daring directions in his own work, creating these abstract, dramatic, and angular pieces of work for Ma Fischer and for other patrons that we saw towards the beginning of this talk. So I've always wondered why it was that Ma Fischer paid for Wharton to go to Europe. But after seeing some of the things that he created for her, from the corner desk to the hall bench, ultimately to her company's boardroom, paying for Esherick's trip to Germany really paid Ma Fischer dividends for the next 15 years of her commissions. And I put these two images on the screen to kind of highlight some of the new directions that Esherick took. So this table lamp was not made for Ma Fisher, but it was made contemporaneously to the corner desk that he created for her. And we see in this sketch on the right side of the screen what I imagine is maybe a design sketch for this very table lamp. I don't know that it was done while he was abroad in Europe, although it is in those sketchbooks. But it's possible that Esherick was taking inspiration from this very traditional table leg that he sketched and was looking at these kind of facets and angles that were created in order to turn it into something new and exciting. So that's about all we have for today. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'd be happy to pull up any more slides if people want to go back and look at them. And we'll follow up to this talk with a bunch of other materials that can expand on this trip to Germany if you're interested in learning more. We have spotlights around the Daring Design Show, where Mark Spheri talks about Hannah Weil's work and their trip a little bit more. We have some spotlights and blog posts about the Holzhausen curtain and Esherick's other travels. So I'd be happy to share all of those resources if people are interested in digging in a little bit more. All right. And if people are feeling a little bit shy, you're always welcome to follow up via email. You can reach me at ethan@whartonesherickmuseum.org, or you can direct any questions as well to info@whartonesherickmuseum.org.